The synoptic problem is the challenge of explaining the similarities and differences between the first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, also known as the Synoptic Gospels. The Synoptic Gospels are called such because they can be seen together due to their significant overlap in content, sequence, and even individual wording. Yet, despite these similarities, there's also notable differences between the three Gospels. These parallels and divergences raise questions about the literary relationship between these texts. Did the authors use common sources? Did they copy from each other? This is the essence of the synoptic problem. To address the synoptic problem, New Testament scholars have proposed several theories. Two of the most prominent are called the two-source theory and the Farrer theory. Each explains how the three different synoptic gospels relate to one another and the order in which they were written. Both theories hold to what is called Markan Priority. This is the claim that the Gospel of Mark was written first and was used by both Matthew and Luke. Scholars support this idea by noting that Mark's Gospel is shorter than Matthew's and Luke's, and that the later Gospels expand on episodes and teachings in Mark. Mark also contains less refined language that's improved by Matthew and Luke. The later Gospels edit Mark to read better in literary mode. The assumption for both the two-source theory and the Farrer theory is that both Matthew and Luke had access to Mark's Gospel and used and copied from it as a foundational text. The two-source theory remains the most widely accepted solution to the synoptic problem. At present, I'd estimate that about 60 to 70% of New Testament scholars accept the two-source theory as the best solution to the synoptic problem. According to this theory, in addition to Mark, the Gospels of Matthew and Luke use another hypothetical document, which they call Q. It stands for Quelle, which is the German word for source. The second source, Q, is believed to be a collection largely made up of Jesus' sayings and teachings. Q explains the material that's shared between Matthew and Luke, but is not found in the Gospel of Mark. This includes things like the Beatitudes and the Lord's Prayer. No physical copy of Q has ever been found, but scholars have reconstructed what they think Q contained on the basis of this shared material between Matthew and Luke that's not found in Mark. The two-source theory neatly explains the synoptic relationships, but it isn't without its critics. Some scholars find the hypothetical nature of Q problematic, given that no manuscript evidence for Q exists and no one in early Christianity makes mentions of a saying source that would resemble Q. Enter the Farrer theory. The Farrer theory is another solution to the synoptic problem that does away with the need for Q entirely. Proposed by Austin Farrer in the mid-20th century, this theory suggests a sequential use of the Gospels. Mark was written first, that is, Markan Priority, followed by Matthew, who used Mark, and then Luke, who used both Matthew and Mark. The Farrer theory posits that Luke had access to Matthew's Gospel in addition to access to Mark's Gospel. This theory accounts for the shared material between Matthew and Luke by suggesting that Luke copied directly from Matthew and Mark, which eliminates the need for a hypothetical Q source. Of these two main theories, the Farrer theory is still less popular amongst New Testament scholars. I'd estimate that about 30 to 40% of New Testament scholars hold to this theory, though that number has been growing in recent years. Both the two-source and the Farrer theories have evidence that supports the one over the other. When it comes to the two-source theory, the biggest point in its favor is the consistency of the material that's shared between Matthew and Luke, and the way that this material differs from what is shared between Matthew, Luke, and Mark. That is, with Matthew and Luke, that shared material seems to be a lot more similar to the material that's shared between all three Gospels, between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That is, Q seems to have its own agenda and ideology that's somewhat different than Mark's agenda, different than Matthew's agenda, and different than Luke's agenda. Moreover, Matthew and Luke place their shared material, which two source theorists explain as coming from Q, in different places in their Gospels. If Luke were using Matthew, as the Farrer theorists hold, we'd expect Luke to follow closely the order of Matthew as Luke does for Mark. Also, if Luke used Matthew, the author made some interesting changes and omissions. For example, the beginnings of both Matthew and Luke are similar to one another in form, but they're different to one another in content. Unlike Mark, both Matthew and Luke contain genealogies and infancy narratives at their beginnings. That is, stories of Jesus' birth and also who his lineage comes from. Yet, these genealogies and infancy narratives are significantly different from one another in Matthew and Luke. Two source theorists ask why Luke would have changed the infancy narratives in the genealogy. If Luke copied from Matthew, as Farrer theorists hold, they also leave out, that is, Luke also leaves out some material that seems to fit well with Luke's theology, such as Matthew's story of the goats and the sheep, whose message aligns very well with Luke's concern for the poor and the downtrodden. The greatest strength of the Farrer theory is its simplicity. It doesn't require the existence of an additional lost document. There's not been a shred of manuscript evidence for a document like Q in any archaeological finds, and no one in the early church mentions a document that sounds like Q. If Q did in fact exist, it truly has been lost to history. The Farrer theory can also best explain why Luke sometimes agrees with Matthew against Mark. That is, in episodes that appear in all three Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, there are places where Luke and Matthew have minor differences from Mark that are the exact same in Matthew and Luke. These are what we call the minor agreements. The two-source theory struggles to account for these minor agreements because under the two-source theory, Luke isn't looking at Matthew at all, and therefore Matthew and Luke must have decided to edit Mark in the exact same way when they agree in these minor places. For Farrer theorists, this is far too coincidental, and they claim that Luke, following the way Matthew edited Mark, makes way better sense. That is to say, Luke looks at Matthew and Mark and decides to go with Matthew's version over Mark's version in particular cases, and this explains why Luke aligns with Matthew over Mark when there is a passage in all three Gospels. Finally, the very beginning of Luke indicates that the author was aware of a variety of sources. This is one of the reasons that the Farrer theorists think that Matthew used Luke and not the other way around. Of course, the reference to multiple other texts about Jesus in Luke 1 could refer to the Q source, but it seems more likely to Farrer theorists that Luke 1 refers to sources of a similar type. Mark and Matthew are both narrative documents about Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, whereas Q is thought to be a document containing sayings and teachings of Jesus in bare form, not embedded in a story. In conclusion, the Synoptic Problem remains a central question in New Testament studies. The two-source theory and the Farrer theory are two of the most compelling solutions, each with its own strengths and weaknesses. Understanding these theories helps us appreciate the complex literary relationship between the Synoptic Gospels and the methods that scholars use to unravel these historical mysteries.